Barren Dusty Plains. Josie Josephine Rollins had always dreamed of leaving her small town, but when her sister got kidnapped, she needed to put her life on hold to save her. "I'm sorry," she said, as she quit her job. Family comes first. Chapter 1. Dust and Departed Dreams. The swing creaked a mournful tune, a rusty counterpoint to the sighing wind that swept across the porch of the Rollins homestead. Josie Josephine, when she was feeling particularly formal, which was almost never stared out at the swirling dust devils dancing across the parched landscape. They were like her dreams, she thought, swirling and ephemeral, always just out of reach. Dreams of a life beyond Dust Bowl Creek, a life beyond the endless cycle of serving watered-down whiskey and fending off the clumsy advances of lonely ranchers. She'd once had a suitcase, packed and ready, hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her room. Inside, a few carefully folded dresses, a worn copy of Jane Eyre's Secret Indulgence, and a train ticket to, well, anywhere else. San Francisco, maybe. Or even further, to the East Coast, where she imagined bustling cities filled with music and lights, a world away from the gritty reality of her existence. The suitcase was still there, gathering dust, a silent testament to a future abandoned. The air, thick with the scent of dry earth and distant wood smoke, carried the faint sound of hammering from the barn. Her father, Silas, was likely mending a fence or fixing a broken wagon wheel. He was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, his face weathered and etched with the hardships of a life spent battling the elements. He hadn't said much since Martha disappeared. Martha, Josie's younger sister, a whirlwind of bright laughter and reckless energy, the antithesis of Josie's quiet practicality. Martha, who had always been the adventurous one, the one who craved excitement and chafed at the confines of Dust Bowl Creek. Now she was just gone. Kidnapped, the terse telegram from Sheriff Buckley had stated. Ransom demanded. Details to follow. Josie gripped the worn rope of the swing, her knuckles white. The telegram, crumpled and stained with her tears, lay heavy in the pocket of her apron. It felt like a lead weight, dragging her down, suffocating her. Family comes first. The words echoed in her mind, her own words, spoken to Mr. Henderson at the Golden Barrel Saloon just hours ago. "I'm sorry," she'd said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Family comes first. Mr. Henderson, a stout man with a perpetually flushed face and a surprisingly gentle heart beneath his gruff exterior, had simply nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and regret. He knew. Everyone in Dust Bowl Creek knew the unspoken code of the West. Family was everything. Loyalty, an unbreakable bond. She had handed him back her apron, the starched white fabric a stark contrast to the worn leather of her boots. The apron, a symbol of her servitude, of her dreams deferred. She'd walked out of the saloon, the familiar scent of stale beer and sawdust clinging to her clothes, feeling a strange mixture of relief and despair. Relief at escaping the suffocating routine, the leering gazes, the endless pouring of drinks. Despair at the reason for her escape, the gaping hole that Martha's absence had ripped in their lives. The hammering stopped. Josie watched as her father emerged from the barn, wiping his brow with a bandana. He paused, looking out at the horizon, his silhouette stark against the fiery sunset. He didn't see her, not yet. He was lost in his own thoughts, his own grief. Josie knew that look. She saw it every time she looked in the mirror. He turned finally, his gaze finding hers. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of hope, or maybe it was just the reflection of the setting sun. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Josie," he said, his voice rough, like sandpaper. "Buckley's coming by later. Said he had news." News. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Josie swallowed, the lump in her throat making it difficult to breathe. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling dust devils, still dancing their wild, untamed dance. Her own dreams felt further away than ever, lost in the gathering gloom, swallowed by the dust and the silence of the unforgiving land. The creak of the swing, a lonely lament, was the only sound that broke the stillness. The weight in her apron pocket felt heavier than ever before. And deep down, a chilling premonition told her that the news Sheriff Buckley carried would change everything, forever shattering whatever fragile piece remained in their shattered world. Chapter 2. The Shadow of a Kidnapping. The kerosene lamp cast long, flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the Rollins cabin, illuminating the faces gathered around the worn wooden table. Sheriff Buckley, a man whose girth strained the buttons of his uniform, sat heavily, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling before him. His face, usually ruddy, was pale, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went beyond the late hour. Silas sat opposite him, his hands, calloused and scarred, clasped tightly together. Josie stood by the stove, pretending to busy herself with warming the coffee, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The ransom," Buckley began, his voice low and gravelly, "is substantial. $5,000. $5,000. The sum was astronomical, a fortune in Dust Bowl Creek. Josie felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. It was more money than they'd seen in their entire lives combined. The sale of the ranch, even at its peak, wouldn't fetch half that amount. Silas didn't flinch, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Where?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "Black Ridge Canyon," Buckley replied, his gaze shifting to the window, as if he could see the desolate canyon through the darkness. 3 days. They want it delivered alone. Black Ridge Canyon. A known outlaw hideout, a place of shadows and whispers, where the law held little sway. Josie knew the stories, the tales of ambushes and betrayals, of men who had ridden in and never been seen again. A shiver ran down her spine. "Alone?" Josie spoke before she could stop herself, the word escaping her lips like a gasp. Buckley turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "They were specific," Josie said. "If they saw anyone else, well, they wouldn't be responsible for Martha's safety." The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Josie felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, burning away the fear. These men, these outlaws, had dared to take her sister, to threaten her life, to demand a king's ransom from a family that had nothing. "Who are they?" Silas asked, his voice still calm, but with an underlying steeliness that Josie had rarely heard. Buckley hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, as if checking for unseen listeners. We don't know for sure. But there's talk whispers about a new gang. They call themselves the Shadow Riders. Ruthless, they say. Led by a man known only as Silas." Josie felt a jolt, a strange, unsettling feeling of déjà vu. The name it echoed her father's, a cruel twist of fate, a dark irony that sent a chill down her spine. Her father, however, remained impassive, his expression unreadable. "Silas," he repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at Buckley, his eyes narrowed. "You think this Silas has some connection to me?" Buckley shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "It's possible. Maybe an old enemy. Someone looking for revenge." Revenge? Josie racked her brain, trying to think of anyone who would hold such a grudge against her father. He was a hard man, yes, but he was fair. He kept to himself, mostly. He had his share of disagreements, the usual disputes over land and water rights, but nothing that would warrant this barbarity. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the stove and the mournful howl of a coyote in the distance. Josie felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that there was more to this than they were being told. Secrets, hidden beneath the surface, like the treacherous quicksand that lay hidden beneath the seemingly solid ground of the desert. "We don't have that kind of money," Josie said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "We'll find it," he said, his voice firm. "We'll sell everything. The cattle, the horses, the ranch. The ranch. Their home. The only life they'd ever known." Josie felt a pang of sadness, a deep ache in her chest. But it was nothing compared to the thought of losing Martha. She would gladly give up everything, her dreams, her future, her very life, to get her sister back. I'll go with you, Josie said, the words tumbling out before she could think them through. Silas shook his head, his expression hardening.
No.
It's too dangerous. They said alone. I won't risk both my daughters. But Pano, Josie, he interrupted, his voice brooking no argument. I'll handle this. You stay here. You're safer here. Safer?
Josie doubted that.
She felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition of danger that she couldn't shake. She knew, deep down, that she couldn't just stay here, waiting, helpless. She had to do something. She had to help. Even if it meant facing the Shadow Riders, even if it meant risking her own life. Martha's life depended on it. And family, after all, came first. The thought of Black Ridge Canyon and the unknown Silas that awaited them filled her with a chilling fear, but a stronger resolve burned brighter, fueled by a sister's love and a desperate hope that flickered like the lamp against the encroaching darkness. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Saloon's Dim Light. The Golden Barrel Saloon was a different place, without Josie behind the bar. The usual boisterous atmosphere felt muted, subdued, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Even the piano player, a man named Fingers Malone, whose repertoire usually consisted of lively, if slightly off-key, renditions of popular tunes, was playing a slow, melancholic melody. Josie stood near the entrance, feeling out of place, like a ghost revisiting a former life. Mr. Henderson saw her and hurried over, his face etched with concern. Josie, child, what are you doing here? I thought I need information, Mr. Henderson, Josie said, her voice low, barely audible above the murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. About the Shadow Riders. Henderson's eyes widened slightly. He glanced around nervously, as if worried about being overheard. Now, Josie, that's dangerous talk. Best to leave that to the sheriff. The sheriff isn't telling us everything, Josie said, her gaze unwavering. I need to know who these men are, what they want. My sister's life depends on it. Henderson sighed, his shoulders slumping. He knew he couldn't refuse her. He'd always had a soft spot for Josie, seeing in her a reflection of his own daughter, lost to fever years ago. All right, child, he said, his voice resigned.
Come with me.
He led her to a small, dimly lit back room, usually reserved for private poker games. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and spilled whiskey. He motioned for her to sit at a rickety table, then poured her a shot of whiskey, stronger than the watered-down stuff he usually served. Drink this, he said. It'll steady your nerves. Josie took a sip, the fiery liquid burning a trail down her throat. She didn't usually drink, but tonight, she needed something to numb the fear that was gnawing at her insides. The Shadow Riders, Henderson began, his voice low and conspiratorial. They're a new breed of outlaw. More organized, more ruthless than the usual riffraff we get around here. They've been hitting stagecoaches, banks, mostly small towns, easy targets. But why Martha? Josie asked, her voice trembling. Why kidnap her? Henderson hesitated. There's rumors that they're looking for something. Something specific. Something they believe your father has. Something my father has? Josie frowned. What? Henderson shrugged. No one knows for sure. Some say it's a map. A map to a lost gold mine. Others say it's a secret. A secret from your father's past. A secret. The word echoed in Josie's mind. Her father was a man of few words, a man who kept his past carefully guarded. She'd always sensed that there were things he didn't talk about, shadows that haunted him. But what secret could be worth kidnapping her sister for? And their leader, this Silas? Josie asked, the name still sending a shiver down her spine. He's a mystery, Henderson said. No one's ever seen his face. He always wears a mask, a black bandana that covers everything but his eyes. They say he's cold, calculating a killer. A killer? The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Josie felt a surge of fear, but also a flicker of determination. She wouldn't let this masked man, this Silas, destroy her family. She would find a way to stop him. "There's one more thing," Henderson said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a rumor that someone in Dust Bowl Creek is working with the Shadow Riders. An informant. Someone feeding them information. An informant." Josie felt a chill run down her spine. The thought that someone in their own town, someone they knew, could be betraying them, it was almost too much to bear. "Who?" Josie asked, her voice hoarse. Henderson shook his head. "No one knows. But be careful, Josie. Trust no one. Trust no one." The words echoed in her mind as she left the saloon, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars were bright, the moon a sliver of silver in the vast, dark sky. But the beauty of the night was lost on Josie. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding. She had more questions than answers, more fears than hopes. But one thing was clear. She was on her own. She couldn't rely on the sheriff. She couldn't trust anyone in town. She had to find a way to save Martha, to uncover the truth, to face the Shadow Riders and their masked leader. And she had to do it alone. The whispers of betrayal lingered, a chilling reminder that danger lurked not only in the shadows of the canyon, but also in the familiar faces of Dust Bowl Creek. Chapter 4. A stranger's gaze across the bar. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity and gnawing anxiety. Josie helped her father prepare for the impossible task of raising the ransom money, selling off livestock, and calling in old debts. Every transaction felt like a betrayal of their life, a slow dismantling of everything they had built. But with each item sold, a sliver of hope ignited hope that they would see Martha again. Yet, Josie couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, that the Shadow Riders were tightening their grip. One evening, driven by a restless need for information, for any clue that might help, Josie found herself back at the Golden Barrel Saloon. It was quieter than usual, the mood somber, reflecting the town's collective unease. She wasn't there to work, but the familiar scent of sawdust and whiskey still brought a strange sense of comfort, a reminder of a simpler time. She sat at a small table in the corner, nursing a glass of water, her gaze scanning the room. Most of the faces were familiar. Weathered ranchers, weary travelers, the usual assortment of drifters and drunks. But one figure stood out. He was sitting alone at the bar, a stranger, his back to her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded attention even in the dimly lit saloon. He wore a dark, worn duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, obscuring his face. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand, but he didn't seem to be drinking it, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the smoky haze. There was something about him, an aura of quiet intensity, that drew Josie's attention. It wasn't just his physical presence, but something deeper, a sense of danger, perhaps, but also a hint of something else. Something she couldn't quite define. He turned, slightly, and Josie caught a glimpse of his profile. A strong jaw, a straight nose, a hint of stubble darkening his chin. His eyes, though still shadowed by his hat, met hers for a fleeting moment. They were dark, intense, piercing. Josie felt a jolt, a strange, unexpected flutter in her chest. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then slowly turned back to his drink. Josie felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of embarrassment and something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. A spark of attraction? She quickly looked away, berating herself for her foolishness. She had more important things to worry about than a stranger's gaze. She was here for information, not for whatever that was. But she couldn't shake the image of his eyes, the intensity of his gaze. It lingered in her mind, a distraction, a puzzle. She found herself glancing at him again and again, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. He remained at the bar, silent, solitary, a figure of mystery. Josie watched him, trying to decipher his presence, trying to understand the strange pull she felt towards him. Was he just another drifter, passing through? Or was there something more to him? Could he be connected to the Shadow Riders? Or could he be something else entirely? A potential ally? A dangerous distraction? She finished her water, her mind racing. She had to be careful. Trust no one, Henderson had warned her. But something about this stranger, something in his eyes, made her question that warning. Maybe, just maybe, he was the key to unraveling the mystery, to finding Martha. Or maybe he was just another shadow in the darkness, a danger she couldn't afford to ignore. The weight of her sister's fate pressed down on her, a heavy burden that mingled with the unexpected, unsettling flicker of something new and unknown, ignited by a stranger's gaze across the crowded, dimly lit saloon. The question was, would she dare to trust the flicker, or be consumed by the shadows? Chapter 5. The Price of Loyalty and Longing. The stranger's name was Caleb. Josie learned this from a hushed conversation between two cowboys at a nearby table, their voices barely audible above the mournful strains of Fingers Malone's piano. They spoke of him with a mixture of respect and apprehension, hinting at a past shrouded in rumor and speculation. He was a gunsmith, they said, skilled and solitary, a man who kept himself, his past a closed book. Josie watched him from across the room, her heart beating a nervous tattoo against her ribs. She had decided, against her better judgment, to approach him. The desperation to save Martha, the dwindling time, and the unsettling feeling that he held a key to the puzzle, all propelled her forward. He was still sitting at the bar, his posture unchanged, his gaze lost in the swirling smoke. He seemed utterly alone, despite the crowded room, wrapped in an invisible cloak of solitude. Josie took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and walked towards him. As she approached, he turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of surprise in his gaze, followed by a guarded curiosity. He didn't smile, but there was a subtle softening of his features, a hint of welcome. "Excuse me," Josie said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you Caleb?" He nodded, slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I am." His voice was deep, resonant, with a hint of a drawl that spoke of long days spent under the open sky. "My name is Josie Rollins," she said, extending her hand. He hesitated for a moment, then took her hand in his. His grip was firm, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. A jolt of electricity shot through her, a surprising, unsettling sensation. "I need your help," Josie said, her voice barely a whisper. He raised an eyebrow, a silent question. He released her hand, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. Josie took a deep breath and told him everything. About Martha's kidnapping, about the Shadow Riders, about the impossible ransom, about the whispers of a secret her father supposedly held. She spoke quickly, urgently, her words tumbling over each other, fueled by desperation and a flicker of hope that this stranger, this enigmatic gunsmith, might be able to help her. Caleb listened patiently, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on hers. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer any false reassurances, just listened, absorbing her story, her fear, her desperation. When she was finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. Josie felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. Had she made a mistake? Had she trusted the wrong person? "Why me?" he asked finally, his voice low, his gaze intense. Josie hesitated. I don't know," she admitted. "But I have a feeling that you can help," she added, almost as an afterthought, "and the men say you are handy with a gun." He didn't respond to the compliment, if that's what it was. Instead, he asked, "What makes you think I'm not one of them?" The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of the danger she faced, the mistrust that permeated every corner of Dust Bowl Creek. "I don't," Josie said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But I'm willing to take that risk. My sister's life is worth more than my own." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze probing, searching. Josie felt exposed, vulnerable, her heart laid bare before this stranger. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension, a silent battle of wills and unspoken desires. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm, resolute. Relief washed over Josie, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding her breath, how much she'd been clinging to this fragile hope. But even as the first spark of a true partnership was struck, another feeling followed on the heels of the first. This man, This dangerous, brooding stranger was going to be beside her. And that was a frightening, exhilarating thought. But he added, his eyes darkening, "You need to understand. This won't be easy. It will be dangerous. And there's a price." The price. Josie should have known that nothing came for free, especially not on the harsh, unforgiving frontier. Loyalty came at a cost, and tonight, looking into Caleb's dark, knowing eyes, she realized that longing might as well. The question remained, what currency would he demand? And would she be willing to pay it? Chapter 6. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The price, Caleb explained, wasn't monetary. It was something far more complex, far more dangerous. Honesty. He needed to know everything, every detail, every secret, no matter how painful, no matter how deeply buried. He needed to understand the landscape of her family's past, the shadows that haunted them, the grudges that might have festered into the violence that had stolen Martha. They left the saloon, the noise and the smoke fading behind them, replaced by the quiet stillness of the night. The moon, a pale crescent, offered little illumination, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around them like specters. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel path, the distant howl of a coyote. Caleb led her to his workshop, a small, unassuming building located on the outskirts of town. The air inside was thick with the scent of metal and oil, the tools of his trade neatly arranged on the workbench. A single lantern cast a warm, inviting glow, a stark contrast to the darkness outside. "Tell me about your father," Caleb said, his voice low, his gaze intense. He leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed, his posture relaxed but watchful. Josie hesitated. Talking about her father, about his past, felt like a betrayal. But she knew she had no choice. She had to trust Caleb, to give him the information he needed to help her. She began slowly, hesitantly, recounting the fragments of her father's life that she knew. His arrival in Dust Bowl Creek, a young man, alone, seeking a fresh start. His hard work, his determination, his unwavering commitment to building a life for himself and his family. His silence, his guarded nature, the shadows that sometimes flickered in his eyes. He never talked much about his past, Josie said, her voice trembling slightly. But I always sensed there was something he was hiding. Caleb nodded, his gaze unwavering. What kind of something? Josie shrugged, her shoulders slumping. I don't know. He had a temper sometimes, a quickness to anger. But he was always fair. He never hurt anyone. Except, perhaps, emotionally. The unspoken words hung between them. Did he have any enemies? Caleb asked. The usual, Josie said. Disputes over land, water rights. The kind of things that happen in a place like this. Anything more? Caleb pressed. Anyone who might hold a grudge? A serious grudge? Josie racked her brain, trying to remember. There was Old Man Hemlock, a cantankerous rancher who'd accused her father of stealing his cattle years ago. But that feud had been settled, albeit grudgingly. There were others, minor disagreements, squabbles, nothing that would warrant kidnapping. Then she remembered. A memory, buried deep, resurfaced. A story her mother had told her years ago before she died. A story about her father's youth, a story about a duel. There was a story, Josie said, her voice hesitant. My mother told me about a duel. My father, he was involved in a duel a long time ago, before he came here. Caleb's eyes narrowed. A duel? Over what? I don't know all the details, Josie said. My mother didn't say much, but it was over a woman. And the other man, he died. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. The echoes of gunfire, long silenced, seemed to reverberate in the small workshop. Josie felt a chill run down her spine. This was it, she thought. The secret. The reason for Martha's kidnapping. Caleb remained silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. Did your father ever talk about it? Josie shook her head. Never. It was a forbidden topic. Something we never spoke of.
And the woman? Caleb asked.
What happened to her? I don't know, Josie said. My mother never said. I think she died, too. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken grief, with the weight of the past. Josie felt a wave of sadness wash over her, not just for Martha, but for her father, for the burden he had carried all these years, the secret that had haunted him. Caleb finally spoke, his voice low, his gaze filled with a mixture of understanding and something else. Something that looked like regret. "This changes things," he said. "This complicates things." He looked at Josie, his dark eyes intense. He seemed older, suddenly burdened. The faint lines around his eyes, deeper. "The man your father killed. He might have family. Someone's seeking revenge." It was precisely what Sheriff Buckley had suggested, but hearing it from Caleb, in the intimate stillness of his workshop, felt different. Heavier. Josie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The past, her father's past, had come back to haunt them, to threaten their present, to steal their future. And she, armed with only fragments of a story, and the help of a stranger with his own haunted past, was caught in the middle. The price of honesty had been paid, the secrets revealed. But the path ahead, shrouded in echoes of gunfire and regret, was darker and more dangerous than ever before. Chapter 7. Riding Beneath a Merciless Sunday. The next morning dawned hot and bright, the sun already a blazing presence in the vast, cloudless sky. The desert stretched before them, an endless expanse of sand and rock, shimmering in the heat. Josie and Caleb rode side by side, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that mingled with the dry, desert air. They were heading towards Black Ridge Canyon, following the sheriff's vague directions and a hand-drawn map Caleb had procured from a reluctant and rather shifty-eyed contact in town. They rode in silence, for the most part, the only sound the rhythmic creak of leather, the horses snorting, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Josie was acutely aware of Caleb's presence beside her, the quiet strength that emanated from him, the way he sat tall in the saddle, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had taken on her burden, her fight, as his own, and she found a strange comfort in his silent companionship. But the silence was also filled with unspoken tension, with the weight of their mission, with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Josie's thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and hope, of worry for Martha, and a growing something for Caleb. She found herself stealing glances at him, studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled beneath his hat. She wondered about his past, about the secrets he carried, about the reasons he had chosen to help her. He caught her looking once, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of warmth? Or was it just the reflection of the sun? He didn't smile, but there was a subtle softening of his features, a fleeting moment of connection that sent a shiver down her spine. "You should rest," he said, his voice low, breaking the silence. "We'll be riding all day." Josie shook her head.
"I'm fine."
She wasn't, of course. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. But she couldn't rest, couldn't relax, not with Martha's fate hanging in the balance. Caleb didn't argue. He simply nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. He understood, Josie realized. He understood the fear, the desperation, the relentless drive that kept her going. He carried his own burdens, she suspected his own demons. They stopped briefly at midday, seeking shade beneath a towering rock formation. They shared a meager meal of dried meat and hardtack, washing it down with water from their canteens. The heat was oppressive, the air thick and still. "Tell me about Martha," Caleb said, his voice breaking the silence. Josie looked at him, surprised. She hadn't expected him to ask. She smiled, faintly, the memory of her sister bringing a brief respite from the fear. "Martha," she said, her voice filled with affection, "is a whirlwind. She's always been the adventurous one, the one who craved excitement, who dreamed of escaping Dust Bowl Creek." "Like you?" Caleb asked, his gaze probing. Josie hesitated. "Yes," she admitted. "Like me. But I was always the practical one, the one who stayed behind, who put family first."
"And now?" Caleb asked.
Josie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "And now," she said, "I'm going to get her back. No matter what it takes." Caleb nodded, his gaze unwavering. "We will," he said, his voice firm, resolute. The we hung between them. It wasn't just her fight anymore. They continued their journey, the sun beating down on them with relentless fury. The landscape grew increasingly desolate, the rocks sharper, the canyons deeper. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else. Something wild, untamed, dangerous. As they approached Black Ridge Canyon, Josie felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling of her skin. This was it, she thought. The place where Martha was being held. The place where their fate would be decided. The place where she would face the Shadow Riders and their masked leader, Silas. The merciless sun seemed to amplify the danger, reflecting the heat of the impending confrontation, the burning uncertainty of what awaited them in the shadowed depths of the canyon. But beside her, Caleb rode steady and strong, a silent promise against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Chapter 8. The Unforgiving Land's Embrace. Black Ridge Canyon was a scar on the face of the earth, a deep, winding gorge carved by centuries of wind and water. The walls were steep and jagged, the rocks a mosaic of red, brown, and black, stained by time and the elements. The air was cooler here, shaded from the relentless sun, but it held a stillness, a sense of foreboding, that made Josie's skin crawl. They rode slowly, cautiously, their horses' hooves echoing in the narrow passage. Caleb's hand rested on the butt of his gun, his eyes constantly scanning the rocks above, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. Josie's own hand trembled as she held the reins, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Stay close," Caleb said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "And be ready for anything." Josie nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She trusted Caleb, implicitly, but the fear was almost overwhelming. She knew that they were walking into a trap, that the Shadow Riders were waiting for them, that the odds were stacked against them. They rounded a bend, and Josie gasped. The canyon opened up into a small, hidden valley, a pocket of unexpected green amidst the barren rock. A stream trickled through the center, nourishing a cluster of cottonwood trees and a patch of surprisingly lush grass. It was an oasis, a sanctuary, but it was also a prison. Several rough-hewn cabins were clustered near the stream, smoke curling from their chimneys. Figures moved around the cabins, men, armed and watchful. The Shadow Riders. Josie felt a surge of fear, but also a flicker of relief. Martha was here. Somewhere. Caleb reined in his horse, his gaze fixed on the cabins. He studied the scene, calculating, assessing. Josie watched him, her heart in her throat. He was her only hope, her protector, her something more. "There," Caleb said, pointing to a small cabin, set slightly apart from the others. "That's where they'll be holding her. I can feel it." It was an odd thing to say, but Josie didn't question him. He dismounted, handing her the reins of his horse. "Stay here," he said. "And stay hidden. I'll go in alone." "No," Josie said, her voice firm. "I'm going with you." Caleb frowned, his eyes darkening. "It's too dangerous, Josie." I'm not afraid," Josie interrupted, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. "She's my sister. I'm going with you." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. He saw the fear, yes, but he also saw the determination, the unwavering loyalty, the fierce love that burned in her eyes. He knew he couldn't stop her. He nodded, slowly. "All right," he said. "But stay behind me."
"And do exactly as I say."
They approached the cabin, slowly, cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of violence. Josie could hear the murmur of voices from inside the cabins, the occasional clink of metal, the nervous whinnying of horses. As they neared the cabin Caleb had indicated, a figure emerged from the doorway. A man, tall and lean, his face obscured by a black bandana. Silas. The leader of the Shadow Riders. He stopped, his eyes fixed on Caleb, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Josie felt a chill run down her spine. This was it, she thought. The moment of truth. The confrontation. "You brought the money?" Silas asked, his voice raspy, distorted by the mask. Caleb nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I did. Where is she?" Silas gestured towards the cabin with his head. "Inside.
Safe for now."
The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Josie felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, burning away the fear. She wanted to rush forward, to attack this man, to tear off his mask, to demand her sister back. But she knew she had to be patient, to trust Caleb, to follow his lead. "Let me see her," Caleb said, his voice calm, but with an underlying steeliness that Josie had rarely heard. Silas hesitated, his eyes narrowed. He studied Caleb, assessing him, trying to gauge his intentions. The tension was palpable, a silent battle of wills, a prelude to the violence that seemed inevitable. The unforgiving land, in its embrace, held its breath, waiting. The seemingly serene oasis had become a stage for a desperate showdown, the quiet beauty a stark contrast to the deadly game unfolding within its heart. Josie, caught between fear and fury, knew that the next few moments would determine not only Martha's fate, but the fate of everyone present, including her own increasingly complicated feelings for the man standing between her and the shadows. Chapter 9. Secrets Carved in Weathered Wood. Silas gave a curt nod, stepping aside to allow Caleb to enter the cabin. Josie followed close behind, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol hidden beneath her skirt, a precaution Caleb had insisted upon, teaching her the basics of its use during their journey. The cabin was dimly lit, the only light source a single, flickering oil lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and stale tobacco. And in the corner, tied to a chair, was Martha. Josie rushed to her sister's side, relief flooding through her. Martha was pale and bruised, her eyes wide with fear, but she was alive. "Martha," Josie whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She quickly began to untie the ropes that bound her sister, her hands trembling. "Josie?" Martha whispered back, her voice weak, hoarse. How did you?" "We'll talk later," Josie said, her focus on freeing her sister. "Are you all right?" Martha nodded weakly. I think so. Just scared." Caleb stood by the doorway, his back to them, his gaze fixed on Silas, who had remained outside. The tension in the small cabin was almost unbearable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them. "The money," Silas's voice, muffled by the bandana, came from the doorway. Caleb turned, slightly, his hand moving towards the saddlebag slung over his shoulder. "First, let them go," he said, his voice calm, controlled. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're in no position to bargain, gunsmith." "Maybe not," Caleb said, his voice still calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. "But I have something you want. And you have something I want. Let's make this simple." Josie finished untying Martha, helping her to her feet. Martha stumbled, leaning on Josie for support. Josie held her sister close, her arm around her waist, her fear mingling with a fierce protectiveness. Silas stepped into the cabin, his eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. He saw Josie, armed, her gaze unwavering, her determination a palpable force. He saw Martha, weakened but defiant. And he saw Caleb, his hand still hovering near the saddlebag, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes filled with a cold, deadly calm. "You think you can take us all?" Silas asked, his voice a low growl. "There are 5 of us outside." "Maybe," Caleb said. "Maybe not. But I'm willing to try. Are you?" The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats, with the potential for violence. Josie held her breath, her gaze fixed on Silas, her hand tightening on the pistol beneath her skirt. She was ready to fight, to defend her sister, to protect the man who had risked his life to save them. Silas hesitated, his eyes darting between Caleb, Josie, and the doorway, where his men were waiting. He was weighing his options, calculating the odds. He had the numbers, yes, but Caleb was a known quantity, a skilled gunfighter, a dangerous opponent. And Josie, she was an unknown, a wild card. Suddenly, Silas's gaze shifted, focusing on something behind Josie. Josie turned, following his gaze. On the wall, above the small, crude fireplace, hung a piece of weathered wood, a plank, salvaged from some long-forgotten structure. Carved into the wood, barely visible in the dim light, were initials, SR.
H.
Josie frowned, puzzled.
SR.
Silas Rollins. Her father's initials. But AH? Who was AH? Silas's eyes widened, slightly. A flicker of recognition? Fear? He took a step back, his hand instinctively moving to his masked face. Where did you get that? He asked, his voice trembling slightly, the raspiness gone, replaced by a hint of something else. Something vulnerable. Caleb stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the carved initials. It was in your father's cabin, he said, his voice low, his eyes narrowed. He kept it hidden. He said it was a reminder. A reminder. Josie felt a jolt, a sudden understanding. The duel. The woman.
H.
Could it be? Silas stared at the plank, his body trembling, his masked face pale. He seemed to have forgotten about the ransom, about the standoff, about everything. He was lost in the past, in the memory, in the secret revealed by the carved initials on the weathered wood. The sudden shift in Silas' demeanor, the raw emotion that flickered beneath the mask, was a revelation, a crack in the facade of the ruthless outlaw. It was a glimpse of a past, a connection, a truth that hung heavy in the air, more potent than any threat, more valuable than any ransom. The initials were not just a clue, they were a key, unlocking a hidden history that was about to change everything. Chapter 10. A bargain struck in twilight. The revelation of the initials carved into the weathered wood hung in the air, a tangible presence that shifted the power dynamic in the small, dimly lit cabin. Silas, the masked leader of the Shadow Riders, seemed to deflate, his bravado replaced by a vulnerability that was both unsettling and intriguing. "Yh," Josie whispered, the letters forming a question on her lips. Who was AH? Silas didn't answer, his gaze still fixed on the plank of wood, his mind seemingly miles away, lost in a past that was now, suddenly, present. Caleb stepped forward, his voice low, his gaze intense. Her name was Abigail Hemlock, he said, his words dropping like stones into the silence. Your father's sister. Josie gasped. Hemlock. Old man Hemlock, the cantankerous rancher who'd feuded with her father for years. His sister? It was a connection she hadn't anticipated, a twist in the narrative that left her reeling. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered and fragmented, were beginning to come together, forming a picture that was both shocking and heartbreaking. Martha, still leaning on Josie for support, looked confused, her eyes darting between Josie, Caleb, and Silas. Well, what's going on? She whispered. It's a long story, Josie said, her voice trembling. A story about our father. And this man. She gestured towards Silas, who still hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on the initials, his masked face a mask of pain. Caleb continued the story, his voice filling the silence, his words painting a picture of a past tragedy, a forbidden love, a duel, a death, a legacy of grief and revenge. Silas Rollins and Abigail Hemlock were in love, Caleb said. But their families were enemies, locked in a bitter feud over land and water rights. They met in secret, their love a forbidden flame. But someone found out. Abigail's brother, enraged, challenged your father to a duel. And my father, he killed him, Josie whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Caleb nodded. He did. He had no choice. It was self-defense. But Abigail, she couldn't bear the loss of her brother, the guilt, the shame. She took her own life. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of unspoken grief, of generations of pain. Josie felt a wave of sadness wash over her, not just for Martha, not just for her father, but for Abigail, for Silas, for all those whose lives had been touched by this tragedy. Silas finally spoke, his voice muffled by the mask, but filled with a raw emotion that was unmistakable. He took everything from me, he said, his voice trembling. My sister, my family, my life. He took everything from himself, too, Josie countered, her voice gaining strength. He lived with that guilt, that pain, every single day. He slowly raised his head, meeting Josie's gaze. Even behind the mask, she could see the pain swimming in them. I wanted him to suffer, Silas continued, his voice a low growl. Like I suffered. I wanted him to lose everything. Like I lost everything. And Martha? Caleb asked, his voice calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. Was she just a pawn? A means to an end? Silas hesitated. She was a way to hurt him, he admitted. To make him pay. He paused, then added, his voice barely a whisper, but I didn't want to hurt her. I swear. The admission, though small, was significant. It was a crack in the facade of the ruthless outlaw, a glimpse of the humanity that still remained beneath the mask. Josie looked at Caleb, her eyes pleading. He understood. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the saddlebag containing the ransom money. Let her go, Caleb said, his voice firm, resolute. And we'll forget this ever happened. We'll leave Dust Bowl Creek. You'll never see us again. It was a bargain, a desperate plea, a gamble. Josie knew that they were at Silas's mercy, that he could still kill them all, take the money, and disappear. But she also saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the hesitation, the vulnerability. Silas stared at Caleb, his masked face unreadable. The silence stretched, taut with tension, the fate of everyone present hanging in the balance. The twilight outside deepened, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, mirroring the darkness and uncertainty that filled the small cabin. Finally, Silas nodded, slowly. All right, he said, his voice hoarse. Take her.
And go.
And never come back. It was a victory of sorts. A bittersweet triumph, born of tragedy and pain. But it was a chance, a new beginning. As Josie and Martha, supported by Caleb, stepped out of the cabin and into the cool evening air, a bargain struck in twilight, they left behind a man haunted by his past, a man who had sought revenge but found only more pain. The weathered wood, with its carved initials, remained, a silent testament to a love lost, a life shattered, and a secret finally revealed. The price of freedom had been paid, not in gold, but in the currency of truth and forgiveness. Chapter 11. The Dance of Deception and Desire. They left Black Ridge Canyon under the cover of darkness, the moon a sliver of silver guiding their way. Caleb led them on a circuitous route, avoiding the main trails, his senses on high alert for any sign of pursuit. Though Silas had agreed to let them go, Caleb knew better than to trust an outlaw's word, especially one driven by such deep-seated pain and a thirst for revenge. They rode in silence, for the most part, the exhaustion of the day, the emotional toll of the confrontation, weighing heavily on them. Martha, still weak and shaken, leaned against Josie, her head resting on her sister's shoulder. Josie held her close, her arm around her waist, offering silent comfort and reassurance. Caleb rode ahead, his posture tense, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had risked his life to save them, and Josie felt a profound gratitude towards him, a debt she knew she could never repay. But gratitude wasn't the only emotion she felt. There was something more, something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface since their first encounter in the saloon. A spark of attraction, a flicker of desire, a growing something that she couldn't quite define, couldn't quite ignore. As they rode, Josie found herself studying Caleb, his silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. She admired his strength, his courage, his quiet intensity. She wondered about his past, about the secrets he carried, about the reasons he had chosen to help her. She wanted to know him, to understand him, to what? She pushed the thought away, berating herself for her foolishness. She had more important things to worry about than a crush on a mysterious gunsmith. They stopped at dawn, finding a secluded spot near a small stream. They built a small fire, sharing the last of their provisions, the silence punctuated by the crackling of the flames and the gentle murmur of the water. Martha, exhausted, fell asleep almost immediately, curled up near the fire, wrapped in a blanket. Josie and Caleb sat on opposite sides of the fire, their gazes meeting across the flames. The silence stretched, comfortable yet charged, filled with unspoken thoughts, unspoken emotions. "Thank you," Josie said, her voice low, her gaze sincere. "For everything." Caleb nodded, his expression unreadable. "You would have done the same for me." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, an acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between them. "I don't know what we would have done without you," Josie continued, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "You're strong, Josie. You would have found a way." His words, though simple, warmed her heart. He saw something in her, something she hadn't even realized was there. A strength, a resilience, a determination that had been forged in the crucible of adversity. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a silence filled with possibility, with hope, with something more. Caleb stood up, stretching his long limbs. "I'll take first watch," he said. He walked a short distance away, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Josie watched him, her heart beating a little faster. She felt a pull towards him, a yearning, a desire that she couldn't deny. But she also felt a sense of unease. She knew so little about him, about his past, about his motives. She was drawn to him, yes, but she was also wary. She remembered Henderson's warning, "Trust no one." But she did trust Caleb. At least, she thought she did. Or was it just desperation, a longing for connection, a need for someone to lean on in this time of crisis? It was a dance, a delicate balance between deception and desire. She was drawn to him, pulled by an invisible force, but she also knew that she had to be careful, that she couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Martha's safety, their future, depended on it. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on their faces, mirroring the uncertainty and the unspoken desires that swirled between them, a dangerous dance in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. Chapter 12. Scars of the Past, Flames of the Present. The journey back to Dust Bowl Creek was fraught with a tension that went beyond the ever-present threat of the Shadow Riders. It was an internal tension, a simmering undercurrent of unspoken feelings between Josie and Caleb. They rode side by side, often in silence, but the air between them crackled with an awareness that was both exhilarating and unsettling. Josie found herself increasingly drawn to Caleb, captivated by his quiet strength, his unwavering resolve, and the subtle hints of vulnerability that he occasionally allowed to surface. She yearned to know more about him, to understand the shadows that haunted his eyes, the secrets that he held close. One evening, as they camped beneath a star-studded sky, the vastness of the desert amplifying their solitude, Josie finally gathered the courage to ask him about his past. They had shared a simple meal, Martha already asleep, the silence punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. "Caleb," Josie began, her voice hesitant, you never talk about yourself, about your past." Caleb looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. He hesitated, as if weighing whether to open up, to reveal the secrets that he guarded so carefully. "There's not much to tell," he said, his voice low, his gaze shifting to the fire. "I don't believe that," Josie said, her voice gentle but firm. "Everyone has a story, and I want to hear yours." He was silent for a long moment, the silence stretching, taut with unspoken emotions. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "My past, it's not a pretty one," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "It's filled with mistakes, with violence." Josie nodded, encouraging him to continue. She sensed the pain behind his words, the burden he carried. "I was a different man, once," Caleb continued, his gaze fixed on the flames, as if staring into the depths of his own past. "I rode with a gang. Not like the Shadow Riders. But we weren't saints. We did things I'm not proud of. Josie felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't interrupt. She wanted to hear everything, to understand the darkness that he had faced, the demons that he had battled. I left that life, Caleb said, his voice gaining strength. I wanted a new beginning, a chance to atone for my sins. And Dust Bowl Creek? Josie asked, her voice soft. It was a place to hide, Caleb admitted. A place to be someone else. To be Caleb, the gunsmith. Not Caleb, the outlaw. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. But the past, it has a way of catching up with you, he said. No matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to change. Josie reached out, her hand covering his. His skin was warm, calloused, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. Everyone deserves a second chance, Caleb, she said, her voice sincere. Everyone deserves redemption. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. He saw the compassion in her eyes, the understanding, the acceptance. He saw something more. Something that mirrored his own growing feelings for her. He gently squeezed her hand, then pulled away, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. He stood up, walking a short distance away, his back to her. Josie watched him, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the burden he carried. She wanted to comfort him, to hold him, to tell him that he wasn't alone. But she also knew that he needed space, that he needed to grapple with his demons on his own. The fire was burning low, a few remaining embers were casting a reddish glow. As he turned, the faint light caught something Josie had not fully noticed before. On his left forearm, partially concealed by his shirt sleeve, was a scar. Not a clean, straight scar from a knife, but a jagged, mottled scar, the kind left by a burn. A brand. Josie's breath caught in her throat. It was a brand. And she could just, faintly, distinguish two letters SR. Before she could stop herself, the question burst forth. Caleb, that brand is that? He stiffened, his whole body going rigid. His hand instinctively went to cover the scarred flesh. His eyes, for the first time since she'd met him, were filled with something close to panic. The flames of the present had illuminated a scar from the past, and Josie knew, with a sickening certainty, that the dance of deception and desire had just taken a devastating and potentially deadly turn. Chapter 13. Blood on the horizon. Tears in the sand. The revelation of the brand, the faint SR, seared onto Caleb's forearm, hung in the air like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile peace that had settled between them. Josie stared at him, her mind reeling, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the implications of that single, damning mark. It was the same initial as her father's, and the same as the outlaw who had kidnapped her sister. Caleb's face was a mask of shock, and was it guilt? He didn't speak, didn't move, his hand still clutching his arm, as if trying to hide the incriminating evidence. Caleb? Josie whispered, her voice trembling, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What does this mean? He finally looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own growing fear and confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his jaw tight, his expression a mixture of anguish and resignation. It means I lied, he said, his voice barely a whisper, the words laced with a self-loathing that was almost palpable. About everything. The words hit Josie like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, a sense of betrayal so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. Who are you? She asked, her voice hoarse, her gaze searching his face, desperately seeking some semblance of the man she thought she had fallen for. He sighed, his shoulders slumping, his body seeming to deflate, as if the weight of his deception had finally become too much to bear. My name is Caleb Hemlock, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Silas is my brother. The truth, finally revealed, was a devastating blow. Josie felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her, leaving her falling into an abyss of despair and confusion. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved was the brother of her enemy, the son of the man her father had killed, a member of the family that had torn her own apart. Martha, who had been sleeping soundly, stirred, awakened by the tension in the air, by the unspoken accusations that hung heavy between Josie and Caleb. What's going on? Martha asked, her voice slurred with sleep, her eyes filled with confusion. Josie couldn't speak, couldn't explain, her mind still reeling from Caleb's confession. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt, anger, and disbelief. Caleb looked at Martha, then back at Josie, his expression pleading. "Let me explain," he said, his voice urgent. It's not what you think. Not what I think." Josie finally found her voice, her words laced with bitterness and anger. "You lied to me.
You manipulated me. You used me."
"I never meant to hurt you, Josie," Caleb said, his voice filled with genuine remorse.
"I swear."
"I came to Dust Bowl Creek to find my brother, to understand what happened, to maybe get revenge. But then I met you." "And?" Josie challenged, her voice trembling with emotion. "You decided to use me to get to my father? To what? Kill him? Kill us all?"
"No,"
Caleb said, his voice rising in desperation. I changed my mind. I fell in love with you, Josie. That's the truth. The only truth." His words, though heartfelt, felt like another betrayal. Josie couldn't reconcile the man who had confessed his love with the man who had lied to her, who had deceived her, who was her enemy. Suddenly, a shot rang out. A bullet whizzed past Josie's head, embedding itself in the sand only inches away. More shots followed.
"Get down,"
Caleb yelled, pushing Josie and Martha to the ground, shielding them with his body. They were under attack. The Shadow Riders. Silas. They had been followed. Caleb drew his gun, returning fire, his movements swift and practiced. Josie, despite her shock and her anger, grabbed her own pistol, her hand trembling but her aim steady. Martha, huddled beside her, whimpered, her eyes wide with terror. The desert, which had been a sanctuary, a place of quiet beauty, had become a battlefield. The air was filled with the roar of gunfire, the screams of horses, the cries of men. Blood stained the sand, tears streamed down Josie's face, a mixture of fear, anger, and a profound sense of loss. The horizon, once a symbol of hope, was now stained with the crimson hues of violence, a stark reminder that the past, like the desert sun, could be both beautiful and brutal, capable of nurturing life and delivering death. And in the midst of the chaos, Josie knew that her heart, like the fragile piece of the desert, had been shattered, perhaps beyond repair. Chapter 14. The Weight of a Sister's Promise. The gunfight was brutal and swift. Caleb, despite his deception, fought with a ferocity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. He moved like a shadow, dodging bullets, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Josie, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to protect Martha, fought alongside him, her anger at his betrayal momentarily overshadowed by the immediate threat to their lives. But the Shadow Riders were too many. They came from all sides, their bullets ripping through the air, their shouts echoing in the vast emptiness of the desert. Josie saw one of them fall, then another, but more kept coming, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a cold determination. Caleb was hit. Josie saw him flinch, his arm jerking back, a crimson stain blooming on his sleeve. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He kept firing, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and defiance. "Get out of here, Josie," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "Take Martha and go."
"No,"
Josie shouted back, her voice trembling. "I won't leave you." She knew that she should hate him, that she should despise him for his lies, for his betrayal. But she couldn't. She couldn't deny the feelings that she had for him, the connection that she had felt, the love that had blossomed in the midst of their shared danger. A bullet grazed Josie's shoulder, sending a searing pain through her arm. She cried out, stumbling, but she didn't drop her gun. She kept firing, her aim unsteady, her vision blurred by tears. Martha, huddled behind a rock, screamed Josie's name, her voice filled with terror. Josie looked at her sister, her heart breaking. She had promised to protect her, to bring her home safe. And she wouldn't break that promise, no matter what the cost. She made a decision. A desperate, reckless decision.
Caleb!
She shouted, her voice hoarse. Cover me. I'm getting Martha out of here. Caleb nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and respect. He knew what she was doing, what she was risking. Josie grabbed Martha's hand, pulling her to her feet. Run, Martha, she yelled. Run as fast as you can. Don't look back. Martha, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, nodded. She started to run, stumbling, her legs unsteady, but she kept going, her sister's voice urging her on. Josie turned back to the fight, her gun raised, her heart pounding. She saw Caleb, still fighting, his body riddled with bullets, his movements slowing. He was surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. He was going to die. Josie fired her gun, again and again, trying to draw the attackers' fire away from Caleb, giving him a chance to escape. But it was no use. They were too many. She saw Silas, his masked face a blur of motion, his gun aimed at Caleb. She screamed, a wordless cry of anguish and despair. Caleb turned, his eyes meeting Josie's. He smiled, faintly, a sad, bittersweet smile. He knew. He accepted his fate. The shot rang out, echoing in the vast silence of the desert. Caleb fell, his body crumpling to the ground, his blood staining the sand. Josie watched, numb with shock, her heart shattered, her world collapsing around her. She had lost him. The man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her, the man who had saved her was gone. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, to tell him she didn't know what. But she couldn't. She had a promise to keep. She turned and ran, following Martha, her tears blinding her, her heart a gaping wound. She ran as fast as she could, the sound of gunfire fading behind her, the image of Caleb's falling body burned into her memory. She ran, carrying the weight of a sister's promise, the burden of a love lost, the pain of a betrayal that would haunt her forever. The desert stretched before her, vast and unforgiving, a mirror of her own broken heart, a testament to the enduring power of loyalty and the devastating cost of deception. Chapter 15. Broken Trust and Shattered Illusions. Josie and Martha reached Dust Bowl Creek, exhausted, traumatized, their clothes torn, their bodies bruised and battered. The sight of the familiar buildings, the dusty streets, the weathered faces of the townspeople brought a wave of relief, but it was a relief tinged with a profound sadness, a sense of loss that went beyond words. Silas Rollins, Josie's father, rushed to greet them, his face etched with worry and relief. He embraced Martha, holding her tight, his eyes filled with tears. He looked at Josie, his gaze questioning, searching. Where's Caleb? He asked, his voice hoarse, his hand trembling. Josie couldn't speak, couldn't tell him, couldn't face the pain in his eyes. She simply shook her head, her own tears flowing freely, her body shaking with silent sobs. Silas understood. He knew. He had seen the darkness in Caleb's eyes, the shadows that haunted him. He had sensed the danger, the connection to the past, the threat that had loomed over them. He held Josie close, his arms around her, offering silent comfort and support. He didn't ask for details, didn't press her for answers. He knew that she had been through hell, that she had lost something precious, that she needed time to heal. The townspeople gathered around, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. They had heard the rumors, the whispers, the speculation about Caleb, about the Shadow Riders, about the secrets that had been hidden beneath the surface of their quiet, unassuming town. Sheriff Buckley pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret. "And I told you so." "Josie," he said, his voice heavy, "I need to know what happened. Everything." Josie looked at him, her eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond exhaustion. She wanted to tell him, to explain, to make him understand. But the words wouldn't come. The story was too complicated, too painful, too unbelievable. She started to speak, hesitantly, recounting the events of the past few days, the kidnapping, the journey, the confrontation, the betrayal, the loss. She spoke of Caleb, of his deception, of his love. She spoke of Silas, of his connection to her father, of the past that had come back to haunt them. As she spoke, she realized the full extent of Caleb's deception. He hadn't just lied about his identity, he had manipulated her, used her feelings for him to get closer to her father, to uncover the truth about the past. He had played her like a pawn in a deadly game. The townspeople listened in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the shock and disbelief that Josie herself was feeling. The illusions they had held about their town, about their neighbors, about the man they had known as Caleb, the quiet gunsmith, were shattered, replaced by a harsh reality, a truth that was both painful and unsettling. Josie finished her story, her voice trembling, her body shaking. She looked at her father, his face etched with grief and understanding. He knew. He had always known. The secret of the past, the duel, the death, the legacy of revenge, it had all come full circle. "I'm sorry, Pa," Josie whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I trusted him. I loved him." Silas held her close, his arms around her, his tears mingling with hers. "It's not your fault, Josie," he said, his voice rough. "You were a victim, just like we all were. The broken trust, the shattered illusions, the pain of betrayal, it was a heavy burden to bear." Josie felt as if she had aged years in the past few days, her innocence lost, her heart broken, her world forever changed. The familiar surroundings of Dust Bowl Creek, once a haven, now felt like a cage, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface, of the secrets that had been revealed, of the love that had been lost. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the scars of the past, like the brand on Caleb's arm, would never truly fade. Chapter 16. A showdown underneath the desert moon. Despite Caleb's death, or rather, what Josie believed to be Caleb's death, a disquieting sense of unease lingered in Dust Bowl Creek. The Shadow Riders were still out there, and though Silas, their leader, had spared Josie and Martha, the threat remained. Josie knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The past, like a persistent desert wind, refused to stay buried. Sheriff Buckley, spurred by Josie's account and the escalating violence, had sent for reinforcements, but they were days away. In the meantime, the town was on edge, fear hanging heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of dust and wood smoke. Josie, despite her grief and her exhaustion, couldn't rest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to the story, that Caleb's death wasn't what it seemed. She replayed the events of the gunfight in her mind, over and over, searching for clues, for inconsistencies, for anything that might explain the nagging feeling of doubt that gnawed at her insides. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, Josie found herself drawn to Caleb's workshop. It stood empty, silent, a monument to the man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her, the man who was supposedly dead. She entered the workshop, the scent of metal and oil triggering a flood of memories. She ran her hand over the workbench, the tools neatly arranged, the unfinished projects gathering dust. It was as if he had just stepped out, as if he would return at any moment, his dark eyes filled with that familiar mixture of intensity and sadness. She noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, wooden box, tucked away in a corner of the workbench. She opened it, her heart pounding. Inside, she found a letter, addressed to her, in Caleb's handwriting. She unfolded the letter, her hands trembling, her eyes scanning the words, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and anticipation. "Josie," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm probably dead.
Or you think I am.
There's so much I need to tell you, so much I couldn't say before. The truth is I never meant to hurt you. I came to Dust Bowl Creek seeking revenge, yes, but you changed everything. I fell in love with you, Josie. And that love, it was real. It was the only real thing in my life.
Silas, he's not what you think.
He's not the ruthless killer everyone believes him to be.
He's a victim, too.
A victim of the past, of the feud, of the lies that have been passed down through generations. He kidnapped Martha to get my attention, to force me to confront the truth. I know this sounds crazy, Josie, but I staged my death.
It was the only way.
The only way to protect you, to protect Martha, to protect my brother. Silas and I, we have a plan. A plan to end this once and for all.
Meet me.
Tomorrow night. At the old abandoned mine. North of town. Underneath the desert moon.
Come alone.
And trust me. One last time. The letter ended there and signed. Josie stared at the words, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. Caleb was alive. Or maybe he was. It could be a trap. A trick. A way to lure her into the open, to finish what Silas had started. But what if it wasn't? What if he was telling the truth? What if there was a chance, a slim chance, to end this nightmare, to bring peace to their shattered lives, to see him again? The decision was agonizing. Trust no one, Henderson had warned her. But she had trusted Caleb once. And despite his betrayal, despite everything, a part of her still loved him. She looked out the window, at the rising moon, a pale disk in the darkening sky. The desert moon, the place where their fate would be decided. She had a choice to make. A choice between fear and hope, between doubt and faith. She knew what she had to do. She had to go. She had to see him. She had to know the truth. Even if it meant risking her life. Even if it meant facing her enemy, her lover, her betrayer. One last time. The weight of the past, the uncertainty of the future, all converged on this one desperate decision. A showdown beneath the desert moon, a final confrontation that would determine not only her fate, but the fate of everyone she loved. The illusions were gone, the trust broken, but a flicker of hope, fueled by a love that refused to die, remained, beckoning her towards the unknown. Chapter 17. The Cost of Freedom. The Value of Love. The old abandoned mine was a skeletal silhouette against the moonlit sky, a relic of Dust Bowl Creek's boom and bust past. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust, the silence broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote and the frantic beating of Josie's heart. She rode alone, her pistol tucked into her waistband, her senses on high alert. She had told no one of her plan. Not even her father. She knew they would try to stop her, that they would see it as reckless, foolish, a suicide mission. But she had to do this, for herself, for Caleb, for the chance, however slim, of finding peace, of understanding the truth, of ending the cycle of violence that had plagued their families for generations. She dismounted, tying her horse to a weathered post, her hand trembling. She approached the mine entrance, a gaping maw in the side of the hill, a dark void that seemed to swallow the moonlight. She hesitated, her fear battling with her determination, her doubt warring with her hope. "Caleb?" She called out, her voice echoing in the stillness, her words swallowed by the darkness. Silence. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and entered the mine. The air inside was cool and damp, the darkness almost absolute. She moved slowly, cautiously, her hand on her pistol, her senses straining for any sound, any movement. "Caleb?" She called again, her voice louder this time, her desperation echoing in the narrow tunnels. A flicker of light ahead. She moved towards it, her heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat. She rounded a corner, and there he was. Caleb, alive, standing in a small chamber, a single lantern casting a warm, flickering glow on his face. He looked different. Worn, tired, but alive. Josie felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. But the relief was quickly followed by a surge of anger, of betrayal. "You lied to me," she said, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears. Again. Caleb nodded, his expression somber. "I had to, Josie. It was the only way." "The only way to what?" Josie challenged, her voice rising. To trick me? To lure me here? To kill me?
No, Caleb said, his voice firm.
To end this. To make things right. He gestured towards a figure standing in the shadows, a figure Josie hadn't noticed before. Silas. Unmasked. Josie gasped. Silas, the leader of the Shadow Riders, the man who had kidnapped her sister, the man who had supposedly killed Caleb. He looked different too. Younger, less menacing, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored Caleb's. Josie, Silas said, his voice hoarse, his gaze meeting hers. I owe you an apology. And an explanation. He stepped forward, into the light, his hands empty, his posture vulnerable. He told her everything. The truth about the past, about the feud, about Abigail Hemlock, about his father's death, about his own desire for revenge. I blamed your father, Silas said, his voice filled with regret. For everything. I wanted him to suffer, like I suffered. But I never wanted to hurt Martha. Or you. He explained how Caleb had found him, how they had argued, how they had fought, and how, eventually, they had reconciled. They had realized that the feud, the violence, the hatred, it was all based on lies, on misunderstandings, on a past that had been twisted and distorted by generations of anger and grief. We decided to end it, Caleb said, his voice joining Silas's. To break the cycle. To find a way to live in peace. The plan, they explained, was to fake Caleb's death, to make it look like Silas had killed him, to draw the remaining Shadow Riders out into the open, to finish them. To eliminate the threat, once and for all. But why didn't you tell me? Josie asked, her voice still trembling, her heart aching with the pain of his deception. Because I didn't know if I could trust you, Caleb admitted, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and love. Not after everything. And I didn't want to put you in danger. Again. The explanation, though convoluted, began to make sense. Josie saw the logic, the desperation, the love that had driven their actions. But it didn't erase the pain, the betrayal, the fear. Suddenly, a shout from outside the mine. The Shadow Riders. They had found them. They're here. Caleb yelled, drawing his gun. We have to fight. The final showdown. A battle to end all battles. A fight for freedom, for peace, for love. Josie, despite her doubts, despite her fears, despite everything, drew her own gun, her hand steady, her heart resolute. She would fight. Alongside Caleb. Alongside Silas. Against the shadows of the past, for a future that was uncertain, but hopeful. The cost of freedom was high, the value of love immeasurable. And in the depths of the abandoned mine, beneath the desert moon, they would face their demons together and pray for a dawn that would bring not only light, but healing. Chapter 18. Reclaiming Hope from the Ashes. The battle inside the mine was chaotic and brutal. The narrow tunnels amplified the roar of gunfire, the shouts of men, the screams of pain. Josie, Caleb, and Silas fought side by side, a united front against the remaining Shadow Riders, their shared past, their intertwined destinies, forging a bond that was stronger than any blood feud. Josie fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, fueled by adrenaline, by a desperate need to survive, to protect the men she loved. She saw Caleb, moving like a shadow, his gun blazing, his movements swift and deadly. She saw Silas, fighting with a grim determination, his past sins seemingly fueling his present courage. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of surprise, of knowing the mine's layout, of fighting for something more than just revenge or greed. They were fighting for their lives, for their future, for the chance to reclaim hope from the ashes of the past. One by one, the Shadow Riders fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground, their weapons silenced. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, the echoes of gunfire gradually fading, replaced by a strained, tentative silence. The last Shadow Rider, a burly man with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes, faced Caleb, his gun raised, his finger tightening on the trigger. Josie saw it happening, a slow-motion nightmare unfolding before her eyes. Caleb! She screamed, her voice hoarse, her heart pounding. She fired her own gun, her aim true, the bullet hitting the Shadow Rider in the chest, sending him sprawling backwards, his gun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling of the mine. Silence. It was over. The Shadow Riders were defeated. The threat was gone. Josie rushed to Caleb's side, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and fear. He was alive, unharmed, his eyes meeting hers, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something more. Silas stood nearby, his gun lowered, his body trembling, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond exhaustion. He looked at Josie, then at Caleb, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse, his words barely a whisper. Josie nodded, her own tears flowing freely, her body shaking with the release of tension, of fear, of grief.
She had survived. They had survived. But the cost had been high.
The scars of the past, the wounds of betrayal, the pain of loss they would remain. But amidst the darkness, a flicker of hope had ignited. A hope for healing, for forgiveness, for a future free from the shadows of the past. They emerged from the mine, blinking in the dawn light, the rising sun painting the desert sky with hues of pink and gold. The air was fresh, clean, carrying the scent of sage and promise. Sheriff Buckley and his reinforcements arrived, their faces a mixture of relief and bewilderment. They had found the bodies of the Shadow Riders outside the mine, the evidence of the final, desperate battle. Josie, Caleb, and Silas told them everything, the truth about the past, about the feud, about the plan, about the fight. Sheriff Buckley listened in stunned silence, his initial skepticism gradually replaced by a grudging respect, a dawning understanding. There would be questions, investigations, legal proceedings, of course. But for now, in this moment, there was a sense of peace. A fragile, tentative peace, born of sacrifice, of forgiveness, of a shared determination to build a better future. Josie looked at Caleb, his face bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. He smiled, faintly, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that promised everything. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, their grip firm, their connection unbreakable. The ashes of the past had settled, and from those ashes, a new hope had emerged, fragile but resilient, like a desert flower blooming after a long, hard drought. The reclaiming of hope was a journey, not a destination, and they would walk that path together, their hands clasped, their hearts intertwined, their futures uncertain, but filled with possibility. Chapter 19. Redemption's Dawn, a New Beginning. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, of reconciliation, of rebuilding. The truth about the feud between the Rollins and Hemlock families, about Caleb's true identity, about Silas's redemption, spread through Dust Bowl Creek like wildfire, shocking some, surprising others, but ultimately bringing a sense of closure, a release from the shadows of the past. Silas, stripped of his mask, both literally and figuratively, faced the consequences of his actions. He cooperated fully with Sheriff Buckley, providing information about the Shadow Riders' activities, helping to recover stolen goods, and assisting in the apprehension of any remaining members who had escaped the final battle. He was charged with kidnapping, assault, and a litany of other crimes, but his cooperation, his genuine remorse, and Josie's impassioned plea for leniency earned him a reduced sentence. He would spend time in prison, yes, but he would have a chance to atone for his sins, to rebuild his life, to be a father to Josie, an uncle to Martha. Josie and Martha, their bond strengthened by their shared ordeal, began the slow process of healing. They returned to the Rollins homestead, the familiar surroundings, the comforting routine, offering a sense of solace, a refuge from the storm that had raged through their lives. They spoke often of Caleb, of his bravery, of his sacrifice, of his love. Josie's heart ached with his absence, but she also felt a sense of gratitude. He had saved them, not just from the Shadow Riders, but from the darkness of their own past, from the cycle of violence and hatred that had threatened to consume them. Silas Rollins, Josie's father, a man of few words and even fewer smiles, showed a vulnerability that Josie had rarely seen before. He grieved for Caleb, for the son he had never known, for the life that had been lost, for the mistakes that had been made. He reached out to Josie, to Martha, seeking forgiveness, seeking connection, seeking to build a new relationship based on honesty, on trust, on love. And then, one day, a rider appeared on the horizon. A lone figure, silhouetted against the setting sun, riding towards the Rollins homestead. Josie, standing on the porch, her heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat, recognized the familiar posture, the way he sat tall in the saddle, the aura of quiet intensity that emanated from him. It was Caleb. He had survived. The bullet, meant to kill him, had only grazed his side, a serious wound. Yes, but not fatal. Silas, knowing the terrain, had found him, hidden him, nursed him back to health, in a secret location, a secluded canyon known only to a few. The plan, all along, had been for Caleb to disappear, to let the world believe he was dead, to allow the dust to settle, to give Josie and Martha time to heal, to give himself time to become worthy. Josie ran towards him, her heart soaring, her tears flowing freely, her joy uncontainable. He dismounted, his eyes meeting hers, his expression a mixture of love, relief, and apology. "Josie," he said, his voice hoarse, his words barely a whisper. "Caleb," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. They embraced, holding each other tight, their bodies trembling, their hearts beating as one. The past, with all its pain and betrayal, seemed to fade away, replaced by the present, by the reality of their reunion, by the promise of a future together. He explained everything. The plan, the deception, the risk, the love that had driven him. He apologized, again and again, for the pain he had caused her, for the lies he had told, for the burden he had placed upon her. Josie listened, her heart aching, but her forgiveness complete. She understood. She had seen the darkness in him, yes, but she had also seen the light, the goodness, the redemption that he had sought. They stood there, on the porch of the Rollins homestead, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, their hands clasped, their hearts intertwined, their futures uncertain, but filled with hope. Redemption's dawn had broken, a new beginning had emerged, and they would face it together, their love a beacon, guiding them through the challenges, the uncertainties, the beauty of a life reclaimed from the ashes of the past. The desert, once a symbol of hardship and loss, now stretched before them, a vast expanse of possibility, a testament to the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and the unwavering hope for a brighter tomorrow. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The final confrontation wasn't a battle with guns or fists, but a quiet, heart-wrenching conversation that took place on the porch of the Rollins homestead, under the vast, star-studded expanse of the desert sky. It was a confrontation of hearts, a reckoning with the past, a forging of a future. Caleb, still recovering from his wound, sat on the swing, his movements slow, his body bearing the scars of his ordeal, both physical and emotional. Josie sat beside him, her hand resting on his, their fingers intertwined, their connection a silent testament to the love that had survived betrayal, deception, and violence. "I still don't understand," Josie said, her voice soft, her gaze searching his face. "Why all the lies? Why pretend to be someone you weren't?" Caleb sighed, his gaze shifting to the horizon, to the distant mountains silhouetted against the moonlit sky. "I came to Dust Bowl Creek seeking revenge," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I wanted to make your father pay for what he did to my family, for Abigail. But you changed your mind," Josie said, her voice a statement, not a question. Caleb nodded. "I met you," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness that made Josie's heart ache. "And everything changed. I saw the goodness in you, the strength, the love. And I realized that revenge wouldn't bring Abigail back. It wouldn't heal the wounds. It would only perpetuate the cycle of violence." "But the Shadow Riders," Josie said. Silas, your brother Silas, he was lost, Caleb said. Consumed by grief, by anger, by the lies he had been told. I tried to reach him,
To show him another way.
but it was too late. He was too far gone. So you faked your death, Josie said, her voice trembling slightly. To protect us.
To end it.
Caleb nodded. It was the only way. The only way to stop the bloodshed. To give us a chance. A chance at a future. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged, filled with unspoken emotions, with the weight of the past, with the hope of the future.
And now?
Josie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a love that was both profound and unwavering. Now, he said, his voice firm, resolute, we rebuild. We heal. We create a new life. Together. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a stray tear. I love you, Josie, he said, his voice raw with emotion. More than anything. More than life itself. Josie leaned into his touch, her heart overflowing with a love that was both fierce and fragile. I love you, too, Caleb, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Despite everything. Despite the past. They kissed a long, slow, tender kiss that sealed their commitment, their forgiveness, their future. It was a kiss that transcended the pain, the betrayal, the shadows of the past. It was a kiss that promised everything. But there was one final confrontation, one final hurdle to overcome. Silas Rollins, Josie's father, emerged from the cabin, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and hope. He had witnessed their reunion, their embrace, their love. He approached them, slowly, cautiously, his hands empty, his posture open. Caleb, he said, his voice rough, his gaze meeting Caleb's. Caleb stood up, facing Silas, his body tense, his expression guarded. Mr. Rollins, Caleb said, his voice respectful but firm. The silence stretched, taut with unspoken tension, with the weight of the past, with the uncertainty of the future. Silas extended his hand, a gesture of peace, of reconciliation, of forgiveness. I owe you an apology, Silas said, his voice trembling slightly. For everything. For the past. For judging you. For not seeing the good in you. Caleb hesitated, his gaze searching Silas's face, seeking any sign of deception, any hint of hatred. But he found none. He saw only regret. And hope. He took Silas's hand, their grip firm, their connection a bridge across the chasm of the past. We all have things to be sorry for, Mr. Rollins, Caleb said, his voice sincere. But the past is the past. We can't change it. We can only learn from it. And move forward. Silas nodded, his eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he said, his voice choked with emotion. For saving my daughters. For giving me a chance. A chance to be a father again. The final confrontation, the final reckoning, had taken place. Hearts had been laid bare. Truths had been revealed. Forgiveness had been offered and accepted. The horizons, once clouded by shadows and doubt, now stretched before them, vast and open, filled with the promise of a new beginning, a new life, a new love. The cost of freedom had been high, the value of love immeasurable, but in the end, redemption had been found, hope had been reclaimed, and the future, though uncertain, was theirs to embrace together. Epilogue. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, remained, a constant reminder of the violence and betrayal that had marked their lives. Dust Bowl Creek slowly healed, the whispers about the Rollins and Hemlock families eventually fading into legend, replaced by a new narrative of reconciliation and hope. Silas Rollins served his time, a changed man. He returned to Dust Bowl Creek a quieter, more reflective person, determined to make amends for his past mistakes. He worked the ranch alongside Josie and Martha, his relationship with his daughters slowly rebuilding, brick by brick, forged in the crucible of shared grief and forgiveness. Caleb and Josie married beneath a vast, desert sky, the same sky that had witnessed their trials, their tribulations, their love. Their wedding was a simple affair, attended by the townspeople of Dust Bowl Creek, a testament to the community's resilience, their capacity for forgiveness, and their enduring belief in second chances. They built a life together, a life rooted in love, in trust, and in a shared commitment to building a future free from the shadows of the past. They worked the land, raised a family, their children growing up hearing stories of the Wild West, of outlaws and gunfights, of betrayal and redemption, of a love that had conquered all. Caleb never fully escaped his past. The brand on his arm, the SR, remained a constant reminder of his former life, of his connection to Silas, of the violence he had once embraced. But it also served as a reminder of his transformation, of his journey from darkness to light, of the love that had saved him. He became a respected member of the community, his skills as a gunsmith still in demand, but his focus now on building, on creating, on protecting. Josie, too, carried the scars of the past. The memory of Caleb's deception, of the gunfight, of the loss and the fear, would always be with her. But she also carried the strength, the resilience, the unwavering love that had seen her through. She became a pillar of the community, a source of comfort and support for those in need, a living testament to the power of forgiveness, of hope, of second chances. Silas, Caleb's brother, visited often. The relationship between the two men was complex, filled with a mixture of love, regret, and a shared understanding of the burdens they carried. They had both been victims of the past, of the feud, of the lies that had been passed down through generations. But they had also been agents of change, of redemption, of a new beginning. As the years turned into decades, Josie and Caleb would often sit on the porch of the Rollins homestead, watching the sunset paint the desert sky with hues of orange and purple, the same sky that had witnessed their love story, their journey from darkness to light. They would hold hands, their fingers intertwined, their connection unbreakable, their love a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. They had faced their demons, conquered their fears, and built a life together, a life that was a testament to the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and the unwavering belief in a brighter tomorrow. The dust had settled, the shadows had receded, and the horizon, once filled with uncertainty, now stretched before them, vast and open, filled with the promise of forever. The end.